Greetings and welcome, and today I am going to be showcasing my new Chinese army. The army is a early Second World War Chinese army. Army. It's more of a company sized at the moment, but it will be an army when I get around to finishing it. This is very much a project that is ongoing. I started off with a simple box of German Blitzkrieg Infantry for the Chinese, and these are all the figures you can see here, and they're all just standard Germans, and I've painted them up in the dark green Chinese winter jacket of the Chinese Nationalist Army. The Chinese were, right up to 1937, almost entirely equipped by the Germans. They had German armoured cars, a few German tanks, they used German style helmets. They had German uniforms for the most part, and all their weapons and machine guns and rifles generally came from the Germans. As the Germans moved slowly closer to the Japanese, the Chinese began to look elsewhere for more weapons and stuff, and they started getting quite pally with the Russians. The Japanese being the common enemy of both nations. And the Russians did begin to supply quite a lot of equipment. And of course the British and Americans later on in the war also supplied quite a lot of kit. But this is an early war army. They're nationalist forces as opposed to communist forces. This is the atypical nationalist uniform. It's the winter uniform. The summer uniform was the same helmet painted a dark green with a khaki uniform. The communist forces tended to wear a dark blue uniform in winter and a khaki uniform in summer, or a pale blue uniform in summer, a little bit like the Austrian World War I uniform. In fact, Austrian World War I would pretty much do for Chinese communist troops, but these are the nationalist forces. So far I have two light machine gun units, NG-34s, directly from the German box set. This guy's got a Russian Mosin Nagant rifle. There's a few soldiers with Mosins rather than the German the German Kar-98. Although primary weapon of the Chinese nationalist forces was the Kar-98. Although they did have trouble with ammunition, they had to make their own ammunition. And the Chinese Nationalist Army had such limited supplies that they used to have small boys who would run along with the army to pick up spent shells after they fired them. And they would collect all these shells together and then make them back into bullets again. So the tanks you can see, I have three tanks at the back, which are Carden, Lloyd, Vickers amphibious tanks. They're actually tankettes, although they were never officially classed as tankettes. They are tankettes, and they're little two-man tanks that are designed to swim in water. They're nice, happy little nifty vehicles, absolutely useless if your enemies got tanks themselves, but for the war in China they did come in quite handy because they were pretty all-terrain, they could go through water quite easily, and they were armed with a machine gun, so it was basically a mobile machine gun. At the back here you can see lots of Chinese markings. These are BA6 or BA10 armoured cars from the Russians, armed with a 45mm gun. The Russians gave about 88 BA10 armoured cars to the Chinese, and quite a lot more T-26s. That's another project to do later on. But as it stands, I've got a nice little armoured car unit and a nice little tankette unit to fight against my Japanese forces. The flag is from the Japanese box. It's the standard flagpole you get with the Japanese box, but I've painted the flag the nationalist colours. The rising sun with the sun rather on the red background is the flag of the Nationalist Army. The figure is a German, and he's got a Kar-98 slung around his back, but he's got little civilian bedroll and stuff, so he looks the part. Next is the gun. This is a 75mm. There, it is a 75mm Dutch field gun. It was pretty standard for the Chinese army. The Chinese pretty much used anything they could get their hands on. They used Russian artillery, they used captured Japanese artillery, they used quite a lot of German artillery. The 105 German howitzer was used by the Chinese Nationalist Army. I wanted something pretty atypical of the Chinese, so I picked this field gun to use. The gun itself is put together by Irregular Miniatures for me, and the crew are out of the Warlord Games German Blitzkrieg box set. The anti-tank rifle is from the Russian box. I've just superimposed the rifle on top of a normal German Crawley guy. I've also given some PPSHs to some of the men, and there's one guy somewhere with a Thompson. So a nice little mix of weapons to show that the Chinese were pretty much up against the wall when it came to supplying their army. I think one very interesting thing about this army is the officers. I've done the officers with a Russian cap, but I've given them a Dao sword, which is, you can see in his hands, he's got a Dao sword and he's got a Russian-made PPSH on his back. There's a NCO with a sword on his back, and another Chinese officer with a sword on his back. This makes my command unit, and I do think they look quite good. I like the swords. It took a little bit of time to work out how to do the swords. In the end I actually made them out of card, and I put a little bit of ribbon on the back that you can see on the end of the sword. If you look up pictures from that period, you can see that the Chinese did use a lot of these swords. In fact, they had a whole unit of swordsmen. It may seem silly, but a lot of the fighting was in built-up areas. You don't tend to think of the Japanese fighting in built-up areas, but a lot of the battles in Japan were from major industrial cities. And the sword is actually more useful than a bolt-action rifle when you get right in close. So, pistol in one hand, the sword in the other was pretty much how the Chinese like to fight. Out in the open, then you stick to your rifle. But yes, the swords definitely were used by the Chinese just as much as the Japanese. A bit strange to westernise, but hey, it's one of those things that happen. So here is my Chinese army. I hope you like it. I'm going to do some more videos on this army and how I go about doing stuff with it when I've built the army up. My next project for this army is to give it a couple of aeroplanes. I'm thinking of a pea shooter for one of the aeroplanes, and maybe kick them out with some Russian aircraft. They were supplied by Russian aircraft after 1937, but mainly they used American-built aircraft. The P-40 was used by the Chinese, and the pea shooter was used by the Chinese as well. They didn't do too badly, actually. Although as Japanese technology got better, the Chinese were still being supplied by inferior American and British equipment and Russian equipment, so they were never able to gain air superiority over China, so Japan more or less always held the air. So here's the army so far. I hope you like the look of it. It was a lot of fun painting Germans as something other than they are. So painting Germans as Chinese has been very interesting. Later on I might do some Chinese with British helmets, because quite a few Chinese use British helmets. Certainly the communist forces used a lot of British kit. But for now, this is the army as it stands. I'm going to play a battle report with it later, so you get to see them in action. And I hope you like this video. And if you wanted to do something a little bit unusual and different for World War II, as opposed to just doing Russians or Germans, then try Chinese. It's a very interesting little period, and a lot of weird stuff happens, so it is quite a good thing to get into. It does require quite a lot of research and reading, but you don't have to do too much. Okay, that's been my presentation. I hope you like my Chinese army, and Click like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe, and leave any comments you want to leave. I always look forward to your feedback. Thank you very much.